I'm Dama, and I'm a heroin addict. Thank you for inviting me to come and share my experience, strength, and hope. I have attention deficit disorder really bad, so I'm going to try to stay on track. I wrote an outline. I didn't realize how much my attention deficit disorder affected my life until I went to college. And I should have had some special tools, and they actually give them to people with attention deficit disorder. They have you sit in the front row, and they give you all kinds of tools to help you grasp. Because I've always been a little slow because of my attention deficit disorder in grasping things. So I was born I was wondering whose purse that was. I was born October 1st, 1960. You guys can do the math of how old I am. I've got a few miles on me. I was born and raised in Lebanon, Oregon, and I grew up there, and to this day I still consider Lebanon, Oregon my hometown. It's kind of a redneck town on the other side of Sweet Home, and a lot of loggers, construction workers, blue-collar town. My dad was a concrete finisher, a pretty successful concrete finisher. And I don't know if there's any concrete finishers in here, but alcohol goes real close with that line of work. And so how it works with concrete finishers is they do a job, they pour the concrete, and then they have to wait for a couple hours before they can go back. So during that time, my dad and his crew would go to the bar and wait. And due to, I think, his employment had a role in his alcoholism. I grew up in an alcoholic home, and I just remember my dad being absent. It wasn't an abusive home. My mom was codependent, and I'm so grateful for my mom because my mom wasn't an alcoholic, wasn't an addict. She was a good Christian woman, and she raised me to believe, to have strong beliefs in the spiritual in spirituality. And I did grow up in a Christian home, other than my dad being an alcoholic that wasn't around very much. My mom kind of raised us, me and my brother. I had one brother. When I was 7 years old, we moved from our home in the country, and I had horses, and it was really just, it was a pretty cool childhood. But when I was 7, my parents sold our place, and we moved into town while they were waiting to have a home built. And that's kind of when everything started going sideways in terms of my home life. That's when my dad's drinking really took off. And my mom pretty much stepped up to the plate and raised my brother and I. We were very active. And my mom's kind of passive, so there wasn't a lot of rules and regulations in our home. I just really think my mom didn't have the strength to take care of two rambunctious kids coming into teens. So anyway, I remember growing up kind of in a wacky home. My dad didn't come home a lot at night. I remember my mom's here today. I don't know if you should have your mom come and listen to you speak, because you can't really say. You know what I'm saying? I love you, Mom. Anyway, my mom was codependent, and my mom knows I feel that way about her. We've had lots of discussions. So she was always trying to kind of figure my dad out, fix him. I remember as a child getting woken up a lot in the middle of the night to go find my dad because he wasn't home. And to me, that was just typical behavior in an alcoholic home. I didn't realize that wasn't normal. Actually, I didn't realize that wasn't normal until a girlfriend of mine who spent the night with me a couple times brought that to my attention. Like, oh my gosh, Dame, I remember when we'd stay at your house, your mom would take us looking for your dad through alleys and behind the bars, and sometimes she'd find him and drag him out. And anyway, typical behavior in an alcoholic home. That's the kind of home I grew up in. But I am grateful to my mom. My mom was always there for me. She still is, and she I mean, we went to church every Sunday. She talked about the Lord to me a lot. I remember waking up, and I remember seeing my mom on her knees and praying in the morning, and that was kind of cool to wake up to. And she was praying for her family, and my dad, who wasn't there, and probably hadn't come home that night. You know, when I was about 12 is really when everything started changing for me. That's when I started, you know, becoming an adolescent, and started, you know, wanting to smoke and all that stuff. And we had a skating rink in our town, and that's kind of where all the kids hung out. So Friday night, we'd tell our moms we were going skating. We'd all meet down there, and then we'd go behind the skating rink and smoke cigarettes and drink wine. And so that was really my first experience with changing the chemistry, and that euphoric feeling is behind the skating rink with my friends, drinking Boone's Farm Strawberry Hill wine and smoking cool cigarettes that we stole from our dad or whatever. So that's kind of how it all started with me. I was young. By the time I was 13, I was drinking pretty regularly, meaning on the weekends with my friends. Still going to the skating rink. We would do the thing where you tell your mom you're staying with me. I'll tell my mom I'm spending the night at your house, and then we'd stay out all night and hang out with our friends and drink. And when I was 14, I met my husband, and he was 5 years older than me. He lived right down the street from me, and he played the drums, he played the guitar, and his roommate played the drums. So sometimes they'd be sitting out on the front porch playing their drums and guitar. That's my granddaughter. And anyway, they would, thank you, Ellen. I would be walking by, and they would be whistling and all that. So before I knew it, I was hanging out over at their house quite a bit. And they were old enough to... I don't even know if they were old enough to buy, but there was always alcohol there. There was always drugs. Now, mind you, this is in the 70s. Drugs were available. They were cheap, and we didn't have the awareness, I don't think, yet in the 70s as to what you know, the long-term deal was. None of this say no to drugs like we, you know, came about in the 80s and stuff. So I didn't really think anything about using drugs. I remember pot was always passed around everywhere I went. I mean, even the nerds smoked pot when I was in school. I'm not sure how it is today, but well, it's legal now, I guess. So anyway, got with my first husband, didn't marry him until I was 16. I got pregnant, got married right away, kind of a shotgun wedding. I wasn't even old enough to get married in Oregon. I remember we went to Reno. The first time I ever shot up in my life, I was 14 years old, and I was walking home from... I'm backing up a little bit. I was walking home from school. I was in junior high, and I was walking home from school, and I remember two guys that I had partied with the weekend before pulled up next to me and asked me if I wanted to go out to Lacombe with them, which is a little tiny town. I mean, it's not even really a town, outside of Lebanon. So I got in the car with them, and I rode out there, and this house was called the Hallelujah House, and it's where a bunch of Jesus freaks, as everyone said, lived. I think it was just a house where people squatted. They were a bunch of hippies that lived there. And I remember I went there, and everybody was shooting up, and I just remember, yeah, I'll have some. And I had no idea really what it was or what was going to happen to me, but I did that hit of heroin, and I remember laying on a front porch of that house. It was an old farmhouse way out in the country, and vomiting for hours. And I just remember a man would come and stand over me every now and then, and I think just to make sure I was still breathing. And I honestly feel that if I would have died from that overdose and died that day, I probably would have been buried in the back 40 or fed to the pigs or something. I don't know, but it scared me really bad, and I remember I didn't want to do that anymore because it scared the heck out of me. And that I was going, this is before I got married. Shortly after that I got married, pregnant. Anyway, I'm trying to keep it in track here, you guys. So I'm pregnant, I get married. I'm 16 when I get married. I have my son, Isaac, July 9th of 1977. And he was just precious to me, still is. By the time I was 18, I had my second son, Eric, on November 23rd. And by the time, let's see, so I had Eric in 1978. My marriage was horrible. We were way too young to get married. Thank goodness I had my mom, who had been through the same thing with my dad, so she understood what I was going through, because my husband never, I mean, it would, he would be gone for 2 or 3 days at a time. I had no idea where he was. Leave me home with babies, pacing the floor, no car, dirt poor. And if it wasn't for my mom and my grandma back in those days, I tell you, we would have really struggled. And my mom would come to my rescue. She would be there for me always when I would call, and she knew what it was like to pace the floor with a baby, on your hip. And those lonely nights like that, and there was a lot of them during that marriage. 1980, I left my husband for good. I caught him in bed with my babysitter, and I actually, I would have got a Measure 11 today. I threw like an ashtray at her, and I cut her head open, and I remember there was just blood everywhere. And now this is in the 70s, and times have definitely changed, but that was like the end of my marriage to Albert. We're still friends today. He's dying right now of cirrhosis of the liver, and I've been there for him. And he does call on me, and I still love him. After my husband and I split up, I met a guy named Rick, and he actually was doing time with a girl that I had moved in with. Her husband was in prison, and so she said, hey, I went to visit Mike today, and I met this guy, and he said he wanted to write. So I started writing this guy, and we started writing and then I started visiting him, and so he, back then, things have changed so much, but back then there was a place called Sandy Am now, but it used to be called Prigg Cottage, and the guys actually got passes, so he would come on the weekends, get a pass from prison, and then go back. So we got together, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into when I got with Rick, but I'm lucky I made it out of that relationship alive. Abuse, he beat me senseless, broken noses. So I know what it's like to be a battered woman. I was, and I put up with that for 2 years with Rick. We drank a lot, and alcohol fueled the abuse, and we fought and drank, and it was crazy. And I just remember when he got arrested, he was trying to run me over in a car. I'd gotten out of the car, and I was running alongside of a road in the middle of the night, and I was way out in the middle of nowhere up by Banks, Oregon, outside of Forest Grove, and he was like, he went in a ditch, and anyway, I ended up in this farmer's yard, nothing but farm fields, and I remember I was just standing there. I was so scared because I could hear him coming up and down the road. And a farmer, you know, they get up at the crack of dawn. I remember he just walked outside and he saw me, and he just turned around and walked back in the house and must have dialed 911. And by now, Rick is stuck in the farmer's front yard, you know, and he's buried the car. And that was the last time I saw him that night. I never, ever, ever saw him again. I talked to him on the phone a couple times. He said he came to find me, but he went to jail that night for a while because he fought all those cops. And so I'm sure he got assault charge. And anyway, that was insane. By the end of that relationship, I was ready for a change. I was tired of being down and out, living from, you know, a welfare check to welfare check or whatever it was, you know, working little jobs here and there. I met Bud, and he had a really good job, and I remember he had a sports car he only drove on hot sunny days, you know, and that he kept in the garage all the time. So I thought, you know, maybe this guy here is going to kind of pull me out of, you know, this insanity. So I get with Bud, and we stayed together for a few years, and we had a daughter together. She's 31 now, I believe. And I have 7 kids. It's hard for me to keep track of how old they are and their birthdays and all that. Anyway, so I get with Bud. We have life's going pretty good. The first couple years we were together, but that's when crank. I'm going to call it crank, but they call it meth now. But back then it was called crank. That's when crank came into the picture, and he worked graveyard, and so he was gone like all night long. And I just remember the very first time I tried crank, my girlfriend and I bought $20 worth, and we split it down the middle. You know, you have that one on. And I remember I snorted some, and I remember thinking, this is how I always want to feel. And I remember my house being spotless, and I stayed up for 3 days. This would have been about 1986 or 7. And I remember thinking, wow, you know, I felt like Superwoman. And so I went on that train. I jumped right on board. Before I knew it, Bud and I were splitting up. I remember, you know, just kind of like passing him in the hall. I'd just be coming home, and he'd be like going to work, you know, or it was just, you know, we just grew apart. And we drank a lot. But he did not, he was not on board with drugs. Alcohol, no problem, it's legal, but no, not when it came to drugs. So before I knew it, that relationship was over, and my daughter was, I don't know, probably about a year and a half when we split up. And I tried to keep her for, you know, in my addiction for about a year and a half, but the insanity of that, if any of you guys have done meth, you know, or crank, you know, what comes along with it, and you're just, you know, parenting is really not one of the deals that go along with that, or any drug as far as that goes. By the time she was 3, he took her from me, and I remember I didn't even show up for court. I remember getting served papers, and by this time I'm living in a tent out at Green Peter and Reservoir. It was during the summer, and didn't even show up for court because I knew I didn't have a leg to stand on. I didn't have a home. All the while, Isaac and Eric, my 2 sons, are with me, and I'm raising them, kind of in the insanity of that. I remember my son being up there at the reservoir. We camped there all one summer. The boys will tell you they had a really good time. But it was insane, and they didn't really know exactly what was going on with Mom. But, I mean, they knew enough. But I remember one time my son and my boys were pretty wild. And Eric was in the tree, Tarzan, you know. And I remember he fell out of that tree up there at the lake, and I'm in town, you know, and he broke both of his arms, and it was hours before I got there, you know, and then I had to take him in. I mean, you know, it was, I'm not proud to say that kind of stuff, but, you know, my kids suffered. They did suffer behind my addiction. At this time, I'm with a guy named Tom. I met Tom. He was 5 years younger than me. Rock and roll. I remember all that heavy metal. Blah, blah, blah. I still, when I hear some songs, and I mean, it was deep, the deep heavy metal. I think of Tom. And he's 5 years younger than me, but he still loves heavy metal music because we're friends on Facebook now. But Tom kind of was to a whole nother level of tweakers. Tom, he introduced me to a really dark world that, I mean, it was bad, but when I met Tom, I met a whole different group of people that were really deep in it. Some satanic stuff going on. I don't know if any of you guys are kind of a younger crowd, but back then I remember the guys would set up all night and make these, we call them pickers and grinners. They'd make picks and they'd go out at night and pick locks, and they'd go all over the country, I mean all over the United States, and go out and pick locks at laundromats and stuff like that, and get money to buy drugs with. And it was just a whole different group of people than I had associated with in my addiction before. It's getting pretty dark now. During my years with Tom, and I was with him for a few years in and out of my addiction, we split up, get back together, kind of. He was just sort of there. He used me, and I guess I used him for certain things too. With Tom, I started using IV daily. Before that, I had snorted, but I mean, I'm on board now. I'm using IV every single day. I just became really involved in that lifestyle. I started getting arrested, and I honestly can't tell you how many. I don't remember all my arrests, but I do know that I got a DUI a few years ago, and I hired an attorney, and she said, "Do you know that you have 15 felonies on your record?" And I really said I knew I had a lot, but I didn't know how many. So anyway, I started getting arrested, and I would get arrested for just stupid stuff. Like the cops would search my purse, and there'd be like a scrape baggie in there, PCS, felony. And I heard they just changed that law, that people aren't getting. Anyway, I don't know how many of those I got, but there was a few over the years. So I get put on probation, but it didn't slow me down at all. I continued to use, and you guys probably know how that song and dance goes. You are on probation and are on paper, and you continue to use. Eventually you're gonna get hemmed up pretty good. And I did do a lot of jail time off and on. During those years, I was on meth kind of for 10 years, in and out of jail. My first stint in prison was about in 1990. I think it was about 1990 I went to prison the first time. I fell under the old guidelines. Some of you old timers in here would know what that is. That's crimes that were committed before 1988 fell under the old guidelines. So your sentencing, I got like 5 years, but you really only did like a year on it. They don't have gold guidelines anymore, even though a lot of people are still serving time on old guidelines sentences. So my first stint in prison, I went in with, I think I did a little over, about a year and a half. I met my husband, my second husband, in CRCI. I didn't look at him in any other way other than he was an inmate doing time in a treatment program, and I was too. But back in 1990, Columbia River Correctional Institution was co-ed. I still laugh and I'm kind of glad I was a part of that, because it's like, are you kidding me? You put men and women, criminals together, and lots of babies born, you know, needless to say, that first year. I think they learned a lot. I went back a couple years later, and they didn't have a closet door or anything. The yard had cones. I remember guys over here, girls over here. But anyway, when I first went there, it had just opened. They had just opened Turning Point Treatment Center, and I remember we voted on the name even, and I think Turning Point is still in the prisons. But I remember being part of the crew who actually got to vote on the name. I remember we all would pick names out, wacky ones like Crossbar Hotel. But anyway, and then we all voted in the program, and it became Turning Point. And I think I stayed in Turning Point for 7 months. 7 months. But anyway, it was a good deal. I got it. I got clean, and so I did all the stuff. I paroled and stayed clean and sober for 18 months after I paroled out from CRCI Turning Point. I had a job, worked at a did laundry in a nursing home. And I remember one day this woman shows up at my door, and she's looking for her son who has ran away, and he's a friend of my son's. My sons are about 12, 13, 14 at this time. And I knew who her son was, but I said, no, I haven't seen him for a few days. And then I look out in the car that she was in, and I see Alan, who he was the guy that I met at Columbia River, and he was in the men's program, and I was in the women's side. So anyway, he comes up to the door, and I say, hey, I remember you. And so anyway, long story short, that's who I ended up marrying. He showed up at my door about a week later, and I remember he was gouged out on heroin, and he had a beer in his hand, and he just said, I need a place to stay. Can I sleep on your floor? You know, my car's out of gas. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, I don't even really know this dude. And at that time, heroin wasn't part of the deal for me. So, but I said, hey, I'm working, my ride will be here first thing in the morning, you gotta be out of here, because I don't want my dad's girlfriend, who was taking me to work that next morning, to see you here, because my dad will go sideways on me for having a guy in my house. My dad was kind of protective of me at that time, just trying to see to it that I was gonna stay on the right track, because he'd seen my past. Anyway, so long story short there too, my husband, Alan, who I met at CRCI, now he's part of the fixtures in my house. I remember telling him one day, you know what, my boys really respect you and look up to you. And he wasn't cool with my boys. He would fix their bikes, and he was very mechanically inclined. He could fix anything. And the boys really liked him. He was good. He was kind to them. Paid attention to them. I remember on their birthdays and stuff, always made sure that they had, because I'm dirt poor at this time too. Anyway, so Alan, just next thing I know, he's just part of the furniture there, the fixtures in the house, and we didn't really get together as a couple for a couple months. But then I just started liking him, and we became a couple. And he was really, he was a business-minded, and I've always been pretty, I've always had a lot of friends and just kind of want to have fun and a good time. But so together, he stops using heroin. I remember him kicking heroin. I remember him laying around for about 2 weeks, because I told him I didn't want it around my kids, my boys. meth, here I am going on meth, which was, it was fine, but the heroin, it's got to go. So he kicked heroin, got on meth, started using meth with me, and we started selling it. And I knew a lot of people, and he was business-minded. If you gave your car title up to him for drugs, if you didn't have the money on that day you said, he would take your car. He didn't mess around. So I remember a lot of times people would say, well, Dama, will you come over, but don't bring him. They didn't want to deal with him because he was pretty serious. So anyway, we get together. Not long after we were together, he got busted. He had to go back to prison. Back then you did sanctions or parole violations, you went back to prison. And he was under the old guidelines, so he had to see the parole board. I remember that a couple times, 6 months. Anyway, so we would be apart, and I would try to get by without him, but we'd always be there for each other when we got out. I'd be in, he'd be in, be out, we'd be out together, and that went on for a few years. Always dodging my PO. I usually always had a warrant out for my arrest during this time, running that stressful, looking behind you in the rearview mirror, over your shoulder all the time. I eventually got arrested and went in with a couple years, and that was what really turned my life around. Alan was still out, and he got arrested not long after I went in, and he went back to prison too for a couple years, but he went through boot camp, so he got out way sooner than I did. But anyway, during that last trip in, it was my third trip to the prison. I went back briefly for a few months, back to CRCI that I didn't mention, but anyway, it's my third trip in. My life was insane. I remember when they picked me up, I had ran with a warrant for 2 years. And it was kind of a relief. I remember falling asleep in the back of the police car that day, it was just like a relief. I mean, 2 years of running is a lot of stress, looking over your shoulder all the time. So I went in, and this time I took it serious. I took I looked at my life. I remember I had my grandsons were born when I was in prison that last time. My first grandchildren, and I have 10, were identical twin boys, and they were just precious. And I remember being an inmate, and my mom bringing the twins in, I'm just little tykes. I still have pictures. And I remember them patting them down, and digging through the diaper bag. And I remember sitting there thinking, I don't want to be a grandma in prison. I don't want to watch my grandkids grow up in prison, sitting here, And so I really did make some big changes that time in. I took my addiction really serious. I knew I was an addict. I knew I had a serious problem that debilitated me, and going in and out of jails and prisons had become a revolving door for me. My boys, as a result of my addiction and the lifestyle that they grew up in, fell right in my footsteps. They were in McLaren and Hillcrest and JDH, and it was insane, visiting them and going on, and I still to this day hold a lot of guilt and shame over the way that my kids were raised, because the role models that they had were drug dealers that carried guns, and and the criminal life that they were around every single day was absolutely not what a child should have to hear or be involved in. My mom would take my kids and try to keep them, but they were rambunctious. If any of you know who my sons are, and if you've done any prison time, you would. But they were just too much for my mom to handle, and so the children's services did take my kids from me. And but by the time I went to prison, the boys were on their own and they were out of the system. I never followed through with any of the stuff, DHS. My kids just aged out. You know what I mean? I didn't do any of that. They just turned 18 and, that book was shut down. I didn't, I remember I'd go kidnap them from foster homes. You know what I mean? Because they were old enough to pick up the phone and call me. And yeah, it was insane. But anyway, I went through, when I went into prison the last time, and I haven't been back since. In 1996, I went in. I went into the In Focus program. It was a 6-month-long program here at OWCC in Salem. And I stayed in that program for 6 months, and I was just coming to. I mean, my addiction was, I just started waking up and grasping what they were talking about, and I was going to meetings, and I was really getting it. And I remember one day I was in my counselor's office and I said, "Oh my gosh, it's almost time to graduate." And I said, "I feel like I'm just waking up and just really getting, I'm just getting what they're talking about here." And I remember my counselor saying, "Well, why don't you stay for another round, Amy? You have enough time left on your sentence." So I stayed another round, and I did 2 rounds in the In Focus program. Actually, I stayed in that program for 13 months, and it was a pretty intense program. 5 days a week, probably 5 hours a day. I was in groups, sitting in 12-step meetings. And it was in there. I remember it was that last stretch in prison. I remember one day they announced on the loudspeaker, if anybody wants to sign up for college, come on down to the library. And I thought, well, what the hell? Let's go down to the library and sign up for college, So I went down and I signed up, and I remember when I paroled, it was already in the works. I went and I started going to school at Chemeketa. And I went through that 2-year program. I got my addiction, it was the Human Service Addiction Studies program, and before I knew it, I was doing an internship in an alcohol and drug treatment agency, and next thing I know, they were hiring me. I'm actually working. I worked in the addictions field for 8 years. I was an alcohol and drug counselor, did most of my experience working in that field in Albany at Emergence. I've worked at Pacific Ridge. I've worked at Bridgeway. During this time, though, when I'm clean and sober and I'm going to school, I ended up getting my bachelor's degree. I went to PCC, or Portland State, PCC. Portland State, just jumped over, got my bachelor's. It was back then, I don't know about today, but it was right there, Building 50, Chemeketa campus. Portland State had, what do you call it, like a little substation there where you could get your bachelor's. It was real easy. In the meantime, I kind of didn't tell you guys, I had my husband, Alan, and I had 4 kids together. Lexi is one of my twins. We had twins. Alan, he's my youngest, he's out there. During my time of having kids, going to school, I had 4 kids and went to college and got my 2-year degree and then on to get my 4-year. Didn't slow me down a whole lot. My husband was real hands-on. We're both clean and sober. He helped out with the kids, made it pretty easy on me to get my degree. I'm working nights, and while I'm working nights, my husband started to drink again. And I remember it all started with a picnic that we had, a family picnic, and he brought a 6-pack home, and I remember saying, "Why would you bring?" And he said, "Well, my brother might want a beer," and literally that 6-pack right there turned into cases and cases, and then pretty soon he's drinking tequila. And I'm working nights, so I'm not really paying attention to his drinking. But pretty soon I noticed he was hiding the alcohol. It was, he was putting it out in the garage, and then I knew that, you know, there probably was something going on, that he was hiding it from me. So my husband's drinking like a maniac. I remember taking a Sharpie pen and measuring his alcohol. He drank tequila, and I remember the next day I checked it and a fifth was gone out of it in one day, so I knew he was drinking a lot. And so I confronted him, and he got really angry at me. I remember I shattered that half gallon of tequila all over the garage floor, and I gave him an ultimatum. I told him it's either the alcohol or your marriage, and he just put his middle finger up at me, basically. A year after that ultimatum, I finally left. I moved in with a girlfriend, and she was addicted to Vicodin. She was one of my AA friends. It was, and it was a prescription. But I mean, we'd be sitting up talking, and she'd be popping Vicodin, and then pretty soon I remember she went, "You want one?" And I mean, I'm an addict, so that's all she wrote. I remember as soon as I started taking those with her, it was all over. And so it started with Vicodin. By now I'm working at Benton County Mental Health. I had moved over from addictions to mental health. So I'm no longer working in the field of alcohol and drugs. I've kind of put it on the back burner, my recovery. And so I'm not talking the talk and around, you know, listening to stories and coworkers that are all in recovery in mental health. It's a whole different deal. So pretty soon I'm addicted to pain pills. I'm buying them under the table. I'm working for the county, driving around in a county car, meeting, you know, riffraff in dark alleys, seriously buying. And I remember I was spending $1,500 a month of my paycheck. I made good money on pain pills. And I remember one day just saying, I don't want to do this anymore. I could be driving a frickin' Mercedes-Benz, $1,500 a month. You got to be kidding me. So that was the first time I reached out for help. And gosh, I'm running out of time. Anyway, I got on Suboxone. And I was on Suboxone for about 1.5 years. But what Suboxone did for me, and I have good things to say about Suboxone, but I would take myself off it and then use. And then when I'd start to withdraw, I'd take Suboxone. So I just kind of used it for a crutch, really. And then I just put it aside. And my husband now has been diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver. They gave him 6 months to live. And right about that same time, my son, my oldest son, who was at Oregon State Penitentiary, I went to visit him one day, and I remember going up to, you know, like usual, every Saturday I'm going to visit Isaac. My son's doing 54 years for assault, one attempted murder, and I didn't share that. And it was very, very painful as a parent. He ran over somebody high on meth, completely out of his mind. Innocent bystander that was just driving down the road, you know, or just walking down the road with their dog for a morning walk. My son thinks the guy's trying to kill him. He runs over him, and for that crime, my son got 54 years. So Isaac's 3 years into that 54-year sentence. This is 2009. I go to visit him one day, and I remember going up to the desk and saying, I want to visit Isaac aging my ID. And I remember the woman who I get to know the corrections officers pretty well when you're there every week. I remember she looked at me and she said, he's in DSU. And I didn't know what DSU was, but the woman standing next to me went, and I was like, what? And the correction officer didn't tell me anything that day. She said there's no visits. All visiting is shut down in all the institutions in Oregon right now. And I just remember walking out of there, and I remember going to my job, and I remember picking up the newspaper, and there was a story on the front page, and it said suspicious death, Oregon State Penitentiary. And I read the article, and it was an article about an inmate that had been beaten to death. And I knew that my son was involved with that. Somehow I just knew that. And sure enough, my son and another inmate, his cellie, over a radio is how it all started, beat to death another inmate. And for that, my son was sentenced to death. So Isaac is on death row today, and that's been very painful for me. Anyway, my husband, I got 5 minutes, you guys. So right after Isaac was sentenced to death on death row, my husband, they both happened about the same time. My husband is diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver. Isaac's been sentenced to death. My husband couldn't drink anymore. Physically, when you have cirrhosis of the liver, your body says, oh, hell no, you're not putting any more of that in me. And so he started using heroin. And I started using heroin right along with him, and it got insane. My husband shot heroin until the day he died. It was crazy. It was insane. I would just remember the last months of his life and watching him die. He was so strong. He stayed so strong. I mean, I'd go to the doctor with him. The doctor would say, well, Alan, you got about 90 days. And I would think to myself, oh my God, if a doctor told me I only had 90 days left, I don't even know. But he'd just be a trooper, and, you know, he just stayed strong, and to the day he died, he was on the phone making phone calls, you know, making appointments, scheduling doctor's appointments for the kids, because that's the kind of dad he was. And he never lost his mind. He was bedridden, but he was sharp as a tack until the day he died. He died. I'm in my addiction, and I just lost it. I mean, I just went completely sideways. I lost my kids. My oldest daughter came in and said, no, hell no. And she took my kids from me, and then I was just kind of left alone and in a house that was going into foreclosure. And I eventually got arrested for PCS heroin, and I went to jail for 120 days, and it's like I got rescued. I was so sick. I remember being so sick from that, but I so needed to be taken out of the environment I was in. And during that time, I really sought the Lord. And I got out of jail. After that 4 months, I went to Oxford House. My second youngest son, Eric, called me one day and he said, Mom, I got busted. I'm going down. I'm going to be gone for a long time. And my son was dealing heroin. My son worked right with the cartel. I mean, it was crazy. They just offered him 180 months, 15 years. He's federal. He went federal. But on that very day, I'm living in Oxford House. He said, Mom, go get all my stuff. I've been staying down here at this hotel. And so I went and got it. And I'm looking through it, and I find meth, and I find a box of syringes. That's the first thing as I look in his bags. By the end of the day, I'm in the basement of the Oxford House doing a hit of dope, and I got a 24-hour notice. And I went back out for 3 months. I went back to jail. After that, I went into a program called Five Rock Ranch, and it's really saved my life. It's really cool. It's a faith-based program. And I drew really close to the Lord, and I, to this day, I walk close. The higher power piece that they talk about in this program, just keeping a spirituality, is so important. And I just surrendered at Five Rock Ranch, you know, and I just said, Lord, I can't do this. It's too much. Take it. And to this day, I walk close with him. I read the Word, and I just want to encourage all of you guys to get a higher power and know that we have a loving God that cares so much for us. Yes, yes, and He's so there for us, and He's what I put my hope in today. And I'm back at the Oxford House. I stayed at Five Rock Ranch for 8 months. It changed my life. I went back to the same Oxford House that I relapsed in, and they voted me back in. And today I am involved in this program. I have sober support all around me. I know that I can't put my recovery on the back burner because addicts can't do that. We have to stay focused and keep it fresh and keep it green. And but the most important thing I want you guys to know is to just get a spiritual foundation, because it makes all the difference in the world. It has in my life. And I have a scripture I want to read as I close, and I'm so sorry. And it's Jeremiah 29:11. And it says, "For I know the plans that I have for you, plans to prosper you and keep you from trouble, and plans to give you a future filled with hope." And He is my hope. And so that's what I want to end with, is that we have a God out there that will give us hope. And I just hope that you all will tap into that spiritual peace that this program so talks about, because it really will make all the difference in your lives and in your recovery, and it has in mine. And I heard Al-Anon speaker say one time that a candle loses nothing of its life by lighting another candle. And I just want to thank all of you guys for lighting my candle. And I'm done.